What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. So we are episode 61 now and we are talking about video settings on the R5, shooting video with the R5. We're talking about the basics, and this time we're going to talk about the record resolution that's available, or the recording resolutions that are available on the R5. Now, normally for a lot of things that I've done in these videos, a lot of what I talked about applies to Canon's other cameras, the R6, the R3, so on and so forth. Video changes that up a bit. So some of the things that I will talk about, like actually the mechanics of changing the resolution, that does apply to other Canon cameras, the R3, R6, etc. There's a little bit of differences there, but the meat of what I'm going to be talking about, which is how the sensor and camera interact to produce the actual video output file, what goes on with the sensor versus what goes on in the selected output format. That is specific to the R5. Now, other Canon cameras kind of do some similar things in some cases. I will make some notes when that applies, but for the most part, this is R5 specific. Additionally, when it gets to video, there's a whole lot of complexity that's involved that isn't necessarily the same or obvious in the way that it was or is in, say, stills. So, for example, we're talking about the recording resolution in this video. There isn't a perfect one-to-one mapping between the recording resolution that you select for your files and the actual sensor operating resolution that the camera is recording in. So that's going to take up a lot of what we're talking about in this video. So to kind of give you a rundown on what I will be talking about in this video, we are going to talk about the available resolutions that the R5 can shoot in. Some of Canon's nomenclature, which isn't unstandard or anything like that. If you're used to shooting video or you've dealt with video, then you'll know exactly what's going on. But, you know, everybody starts somewhere, probably. I mean, I certainly did. And when I first got started, some of the nomenclature just kind of confused me. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. A lot of this video, actually, we're going to be talking about the impact of the resolution that you choose versus the camera's image quality and performance and what's going on with all of that, because that makes a big deal. Touch on some settings that affect which resolutions you can actually choose, because that does happen on this camera. And then finally, we will talk about how to change resolutions on the R5. So let's start by talking about the how, what, why, when, and where, so forth, of video resolutions on the R5. Now, as I said in the introduction, the input and output resolutions, so the input resolution being what the sensor is recording or how the camera is recording data from the sensor, and the output resolution being the file that the camera produces, is not as tightly coupled in video as it is in stills. So if you're like most photographers, when you shoot stills, you're probably shooting in RAW. RAW just gives you the sensor data. If you're shooting in JPEG, then the camera downsamples, and you're not using the full resolution JPEG, then the camera just downsamples to the resolution that you selected for your JPEG. The same thing happens in the video side of things, but it's a little bit more complicated. So downsampling can happen. So can subsampling, which is, in the case of the R5, as best as I can tell, is implemented as line skipping. But additionally, upsampling can happen, where the camera will actually be reading out less than the full video resolution or the full resolution that you've selected in the video, and then upsampling in that case. Now, that said, the resolution you do select on the for your file does strongly influence all of this. There is no case where you say select 8K and the camera reads 1080p, line skipped, lowest quality, something or other, and then upsamples it. But there are places where the camera will do some upsampling to get to the selected resolution. So let's talk about the resolutions that are available to select on the R5. And there are 5 possible resolutions that you can select. These are 8KD, 8KU, 4KD, 4KU, and full high def abbreviated FHD in the camera menus. So the way Canon has decided to go about the whole resolution nomenclature thing is kind of, well, it shouldn't be too far or too incomparable if you are incomprehensible if you are used to, say, high definition TVs, but it is not necessarily consistent across the board. So basically, well, actually, it is consistent internally, but basically the number, with the exception of full HD, which is just letters describing a 1920 by 1080 pixel frame, the number is the width of the frame in pixels approximately, and the behind the, so the K stands for 1,000. The number is like 4K is 4,000, 8K is 8,000 pixels wide, and the letter at the end describes the format. So there's two options, as you noted, D and U. D stands for DCI, which stands for Digital Cinema Initiatives, which was a company that was formed as a joint venture by a whole bunch of movie studios in Hollywood back in 2002 to set standards for the then brand new digital cinema industry or digital cinema technologies. So they wanted to, obviously, when your movies are worth, the budgets for your movies are in millions or hundreds of, possibly even hundreds of millions of dollars, not having standards is kind of a bad thing. So they set standards for resolution, for cameras, for cinema projectors, etc., and what was going on. So the D settings are kind of targeted for that kind of Hollywood cinematic intent. So they're all 17:9 aspect ratio recordings, and they are for 4KD, the resolution is 4096 pixels by 2160 pixels, and for 8KD, the resolution is 8192 pixels by 4320 pixels. Now, the way Canon has chosen to implement DCI and UHD formats on cameras that support both, so that's the R5, the R3, and the Cinema EOS line of cameras, is to have the DCI resolution use the full width of the sensor for its aspect ratio. So in the case of the R5, the sensor is at the active area of the sensor is 8,192 pixels wide. And so when you select a DCI resolution in full frame mode, the camera uses the whole 8,192 by 4320 pixel area of the sensor to produce the image, and then gets down samples or line skips to get the 4K output. Now, the other option that you have are the -U or U formats. These are ultra high definition, and these are, if the DCI formats are the Hollywood or cinematic intents, these are the TV broadcast, the more mundane, if you will, kind of intent. So this is the same 16:9 aspect ratio that you are used to seeing on TVs and many computer monitors these days. It's for 4K, the resolution in 4KU is 3840 by 2160, and 8KU it's 7680 by 4320. So the images are the same height as the DCI format, but they're not as wide. Now, the way Canon has chosen to implement this on the R5, as well as, like I said, all other Canon cameras that support DCI and UHD crop factor formats, so the R3, the Cinema EOS cameras, etc., is to implement these as a crop of the DCI frame. So instead of the camera sampling the full width of the sensor, it samples in, basically crops off the edges of the DCI frame. This results in a 1.5x crop factor. So a 35mm lens on the R5 shooting in UHD mode would give you the angle of view of about a 36.75mm lens on a more full frame type aspect ratio or type format. Now, I would say don't get too bent out of shape about this. There's probably a lot of good technical reasons why Canon implements it this way instead of trying to recompress things, and may have to even do with sensor design. The reality is that you'll never see a difference in terms of depth of field. Angle of view, if you were directly cropping or directly cutting between two cameras in exactly the same position, maybe, but there's so much fuzzy numbers in all of this that it really is kind of meaningless in actual practical use. Now, there is one more kind of condition or resolution that the camera can actually operate in, and this happens when you're shooting time-lapse videos. So when you shoot in time-lapse videos, the camera only does the UHD aspect ratios. It won't shoot a DCI aspect ratio. You can select whether it's 8K, 4K, or 1080p or full HD. but the camera doesn't use the video aspect ratio or the video sensor readout area. Instead, what it does is it actually reads out a full sensor width 16:9 aspect image and then downsamples that to whatever the time-lapse video resolution was set for. Now, I'll talk a lot more about time-lapse videos in a future video on the camera. So let's talk a little bit about settings that can limit what resolutions you can choose, because there are at least 3 primary settings on the camera that will limit what resolutions you can select. So the first of these is when you have 4K high quality mode enabled. So again, I'm going to talk about all of this stuff in a lot more detail in future videos, but it's relevant here because it limits what resolutions you can choose from. So if you have 4K high quality mode enabled, which is where the camera reads out the 8K sensor area and then downsamples it to 4K, you can only select 4K resolutions. You can use the ultra high def or DCI versions, but you can only select the 4K resolutions. The camera can't won't allow you to select 8K, and it won't allow you to select full HD without turning off 4K high quality mode. The other 2 options that will limit what resolutions you can select from are high frame rate and movie crop. Now, when those are enabled, the only option you won't have basically is 8K. So you can select both 4K formats, the UHD and DCI option, as well as full HD. Now, obviously, the reason for this has to do with how fast the camera can read out the sensor in the case of high frame rate, and just how much resolution the sensor is being read out at in the case of movie crop, where you only have 5.1K to work with. Canon won't read out a 5.1K sensor, upscale it to 8K, and give you really crappy looking 8K video. So there are some implications that are not directly related to camera settings when it comes to selecting or what video resolution you have chosen to use. The big one, or the 2 of them, come down functionally to quality. One is quality in a resolution aspect, and one is quality in sort of a time aspect. So the first one is resolution, and it has to do with the way the sensor is read out on the R5. Me in post here, so I just wanted to point out that Canon, as far as I know, has never officially documented how they read out the sensor to produce the various video formats. So what I'm going to be talking about here is based on my own testing, looking at camera resolution, looking at power consumption, looking at rolling shutter performance or speed, and based on what I have read from other published reviews of the camera. Ultimately, the question here is to line skip or not to line skip. So when it comes to shooting video, when it comes to the engineering side of reading out the sensor for shooting video, there's basically 2 ways to go about doing it. The camera can read out every pixel on the sensor and then do something with that, or it can skip lines, which is basically how video on most hybrid cameras in the past has been implemented. Now, the implications of all of this, well, for starters, the readout speed for a given pixel is the same, regardless of whether you're reading out every pixel or you're only reading out some of the pixels. So the implication of this is essentially it comes down to both rolling shutter and image quality. So on the R5, if you are not line skipping, it takes longer to read out the sensor, which gives you better resolution. But on the flip side, it doesn't provide, or it takes longer to read out a frame, so you have a temporal aspect in terms of essentially rolling shutter jello. Now, I do want to note that line skipping on the R5 does produce full resolution outputs, but what I mean by that is you don't have some lower resolution that's being upsampled. You actually have the full resolution that you were anticipating that it was shooting. You just have it in a line skip format. So for example, on the 5D Mark IV, when you shot full HD video using the whole sensor area, which was the only way it shot full HD video, it line skipped, but it only had 945 lines of vertical resolution. That was upsampled to 1080 for your video file. On the R5, because it's a even multiple of all the proper resolutions, all of the resolutions can be derived at the full, like 1440, or not 1440, 4K and 1080p vertical resolutions, 2160 and 1080p vertical resolutions. So what does the camera do? Well, if you're shooting in full frame and 8K, you get the native readout of the sensor. It reads every pixel and it stuffs every one of those pixels into your file. Easy. Line skipping happens when you're in full frame mode shooting in either standard quality or full high def. I don't know the exact details of what's going on with the line skipping, whether they only line skip to 4K and then downsampled full HD, or whether they line skip to 4K and full HD separately using two different skip ratios or whatever. I haven't quite figured out how to determine that yet, because at full HD the resolution's kind of so low it's not super clear anymore what's going on. But that's where line skipping takes place. Then finally, the camera actually will also read out the native sensor resolution and downsample. This happens in at least 3 instances that I'm aware of, or that as my understanding goes at least. So first of all, if you're shooting in full frame with 4K high quality mode enabled, the camera reads out the 8K sensor area, downsamples it to 4K, and saves that in the file. The other 2 instances where the camera reads out native resolution and downsamples is when you are shooting in movie crop mode. So whether you've set it manually or you've enabled it with or you forced it by putting an EFS lens on a mount adapter on the camera. And it doesn't matter whether you're in 4K or full HD. As best as I can tell, the camera reads out the 5.1K sensor and then downsamples it to either 4K or full HD from there. So that's the 3 modes of operation on the camera. Now, the flip side of downsampling is upsampling, and generally we don't want to have upsampled images. At least that's the case for still photography. In video, the question gets a little bit more blurry in some respects, or the answer gets a little bit more blurry in some respects, and we will talk about that a lot more in a future video. But for the moment, the only case where upsampling happens is when digital image stabilization is enabled. Now remember, the R5 has in-body image stabilization, and many RF lenses have in-lens image stabilization. All of that works, including the coordinated image stabilization, when you're shooting video on the camera. However, if you need things even more stabilized, Canon has included 2 levels of digital image stabilization. At best I can tell, the way this works is the sensor is set up and read out at the resolution that you would normally have for the camera to operate. So let's just say we're shooting full frame 4K standard quality. So this would be line skipped 4K off of the sensor. The camera then windows in on that, or crops in on that, based on how much image stabilization you've enabled, as well as how much the camera, and then that window is moved based on how much the image has moved in your shake, or in the camera movement. That lower resolution image, so it's cropped in on that, say, 4K starting point, is then upsampled to the full 4K output that the camera you were set the camera for. So you're not going to actually get the full 4K resolution when you're using digital image stabilization on the R5. Now, of course, the last thing and most obvious thing that resolution has an impact on in terms of things going on in the camera is bitrate. Higher resolutions require higher bit rates. Now, one thing to remember is that we often talk about resolution in terms of linear measurements. So 2K, 4K, 8K, it's the number of pixels in the width of the frame. But remember, a frame is a 2-dimensional area. So when you double the linear resolution, you quadruple the actual number of pixels in the frame. And therefore, to maintain image quality at an equal level, you also need to quadruple the bit rate that's being used to store all of these pixels, so that you have as many bits per pixel now that you have 4 times as many pixels. A couple of things to keep in mind with the R5, mostly for planning purposes, not necessarily for image quality reasons, because you'll never really see a difference. But the R5 does target the same bit rates for both UHD and DCI resolutions when they both exist on the camera. So if you are shooting, for example, H.264 8-bit 420 chroma subsampled 30 frames per second 4K resolution, whether you're shooting in DCI or UHD formats, the camera still targets 120 megabits. Both of them, doesn't matter. And finally, this probably is obvious, or at least it should be probably obvious to most of us, anybody who's been doing video for any length of time or looked at any of this, but The bitrate the camera chooses doesn't depend on the input resolution or crop mode. It only depends on the output resolution that you've selected. So it doesn't matter if you've told the camera to shoot 4K 30 frames a second. It doesn't matter if it's 4K standard quality using the full frame area, 4K high quality on the full frame area, or 4K movie crop. All of those will target the exact same bit rates. So that brings us to talking about changing resolutions. So how do you do it on the R5? Well, broadly put, there are two ways to go about doing this. So the first method is going through the menus. Now, ultimately, both of these methods do take you to the same place. So for the first method, you're going to go to hit the menu button, go to the Shoot One menu, go to Movie Record Quality, it will be the top entry in that menu there, and then go to Movie Record Size, it'll be the top entry in the Movie Record Quality menu. The top line is resolution, the middle line gives you frame rates, the bottom line gives you control over the compression method. So there's three ways you can move around in the menu to make selections, as with most menus. The first one is, of course, you can touch the selection that you want on the screen using the touch screen. That works. Second option is that you can use the multi-controller to switch between settings and move between the various lines. The third option is you can, of course, use the dials. So you use the main command dial, that's the one on the front of the camera behind the shutter release, to change the setting for a given set of options. So pick a resolution out of the resolutions. You use the quick command dials, so that's either the one on the back or the one around the mode button, to change which of the settings that you are selecting between, so resolution, frame rate, and compression method. Think of the quick command dials as vertical scrolling and the main dial as horizontal scrolling. Now, unlike most menu settings in the camera on the R5, you do have to push the set button, either the virtual button on the screen or the set button on the back of the camera, to save the settings and take off or use them to go and then shoot in your next video. If you have pressed the shutter release while you're in the movie record size menu, then your camera will not update to the new settings. Now, the second method to go about doing this is to use the quick control menu on the camera. So when you are in shooting standby, so that's when you have the live view image of whatever you're recording, but you're not actually recording, you press the quick control menu or the quick control button, that's the Q with the box around it, that will bring up the quick control menu. You're looking for the second item down on the left side. You'll know it because it will show you the resolution, frame rate, and recording method. Tap that, use the multi-controller or the dials to select it, and then press the set button on the back of the camera or the set movie record size virtual button on the back of the screen to change or to enter the movie record size menu. Now, of course, this is the same menu as you would have gotten to if you went through the Shoot One menu, movie record quality, then movie record size menu process. It's just a little bit quicker to get there. Of course, the final option for all of this is that you can use you can add the movie record size menu to your My Menu if you are using My Menus for custom settings and stuff, or customizing how you have settings displayed. So you can have the movie record size right there on your My Menu without having to dig through the whole menu, Shoot One, movie record quality, all of that stuff. So that is pretty much the resolution options on the R5 and how choosing which ones you choose impacts image quality. If you found this useful, or at least a bit informative, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.